Welcome and hello. You are the Indigenous Peoples Day Committee for Wellesley and organizing the campaign for the vote yes to question 1 on the March 2nd election. So let's start off by asking you both, why? Why are you involved with this? Greg, would you like to start?
Sure. I just think that it's very important for us to come to grips with America and its past. And right now we're in the midst of a reckoning with America's past, looking at what has happened to Indigenous peoples over the past 500 years is very important for us to do. So honoring Indigenous peoples by supporting the Indigenous Peoples Day movement is a way to come to grips with some of the inequities that that we've all sponsored in the past.
Jillian?
Yeah, and I would just add to what Greg was saying that right now it's really critical. I mean, before and now, but here we are now doing it. But it's critical to honor Indigenous Peoples Day as a way to begin sort of healing from the racial injustice that began, in 1492, and acknowledge the harm that Indigenous peoples, suffered and endured at the hands of, our country's forefathers. And I think we have a real opportunity here, as Greg referenced, to join this sort of national movement in condemning and dismantling systemic racism by making this change. And, as a resident of Wellesley, I feel it's important. Wellesley's been a town sort of on the cusp and leading the charge for many innovations. And I think this is one of them that should be made.
So thank you. So tell us about these rumors that have been floating around that the Indigenous Peoples Day Wellesley campaign is really being run or was spearheaded by students at Wellesley College. Is there any truth to that?
It's simply not true. We have no affiliation with Wellesley College or with any other outside groups. The committee for Indigenous Peoples Day is made up of Wellesley residents only.
Excellent, good to know. And how might you respond to some of the folks in town saying that this issue is voting yes to question 1 in favor of making Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day? Some folks say that might be divisive or disrespectful to towards Wellesley's Italian Americans. How would you respond to that?
So I will jump in as a Wellesley Italian American, and I would just like to say that, this issue, it's not anti-Italian or anti-Italian American, it's anti-racist. And it's an anti-racist stand against the genocidal legacy of Columbus. And for me, as an Italian American, my Italian culture and heritage, and you can see me talking with my hands because I'm Italian, so it's so much bigger than Columbus. In my family, we did not regard him as a hero. He's not the basis for our Italian pride. Heritage is comprised of important accomplishments and notable heroes. Let's celebrate the artists, the architects, the scientists, the musicians, the inventors, the engineers. Italians and Italian Americans have made so many contributions to the town of Wellesley. And I, as an Italian American, I don't want my heritage represented by a racist symbol.
Thank you, Jillian. Greg, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I've wrestled with this question because the opponents of question 1 are claiming that they want to unite Wellesley and that we are trying to divide Wellesley. To me, this is a really specious argument. Nothing could be further from the truth. At some point, as I said in my earlier response, you have to look at the larger question of where we are in America. We're in the midst of a national reckoning with our past, which unfortunately is built upon a foundation of racism and oppression of Indigenous peoples, African Americans, and other marginalized groups. It's true that Italian Americans, like Jews and Catholics and other ethnic groups, faced severe discrimination and prejudice. Today, Italian Americans enjoy recognition, status, and prosperity. Indigenous peoples, despite their resiliency, remain invisible. They suffer from the highest levels of poverty, suicide, infant mortality, and discrimination in housing and medical access of any ethnic groups. To me, supporting Indigenous Peoples Day is a first step in acknowledging the truthful history of 500 years of mistreatment of Indigenous peoples in the Americas, and in addressing the wrongs that have been inflicted on Indigenous nations. Those wrongs include forced assimilation, removal of children from families, land theft, erasure of language and culture, and numerous incidents of sanctioned violence. So as Jillian so eloquently said, I would ask opponents of question 1 to join with a multitude of Italian Americans who have endorsed Indigenous Peoples Day in Massachusetts and throughout the country.
Thank you. So some really, really good points. So President Obama declared Friday after Thanksgiving to be recognized as National Native American Heritage Day. And President Bush declared the month of November to be Native American Heritage Month. How does this affect your decision to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day? Either Greg or Jillian. Greg, would you like
I'll
to start?
jump in.
Sure.
This day is not widely embraced by the Native American communities. Many Native Americans view Thanksgiving as a day of mourning. Celebrating the day after the day of mourning as Native American Heritage Day is highly offensive because of its link to Thanksgiving. Most Indigenous people support the 1977 UN Geneva Conference Declaration, which calls for the replacement of Columbus Day by Indigenous Peoples Day as a way of honoring the resiliency of Indigenous peoples throughout the world and celebrating their cultures. As a committee, we believe it is right to honor the wishes of Indigenous peoples. We also note that 13 states, 130 cities and towns, including 14 in Massachusetts, also officially celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day on the second Monday of October instead of Columbus Day. Newton, I might add, is one of those communities that has replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day and has formed a working committee to pick another day to honor Italian American heritage.
So Newton has decided that that particular day that used to be Columbus Day is not shared by anything else. It's just specifically now Indigenous Peoples Day. It's not shared with Italian Heritage Day or anything else.
That's correct.
That's correct. It's good to know. And Jillian, would you like to add something to that about Obama and Bush's? Right, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Rama, Greg made some excellent points, but I would add to that neither one of these proclamations has an impact on Columbus Day. And again, removing this symbol of enslavement and domination of Indigenous peoples. So as Greg said, it's offensive to Indigenous peoples because again, we're still not removing those symbols, and who we honor matters, representation matters. And so we need to make a change and let people know that we support them, and we don't want to honor that type of behavior.
Right. And that brings us to the question of this 2-day solution, which has been proposed. It's been going around. Like, what about if they have celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day along with Columbus Day, or perhaps switching out Columbus Day with Italian Heritage Day and then celebrating that on the same day as Indigenous Peoples Day. How do you both feel about that? Go ahead, Greg.
Again, if you don't mind me starting, I'll just say that this is highly offensive to Indigenous peoples and to anyone who understands who Columbus was and what his legacy represents. Personally, I do not understand how anyone can read Dr. Delaney's book, Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem, or the writings of Bartolome de las Casas or Hernando Colon, contemporaries of Columbus, or any of a vast number of Columbus biographies and come away with the impression that this was a noble man whose acts and whose legacy we should emulate and celebrate. Columbus, even by Dr. Delaney's account, kidnapped and enslaved Indigenous peoples, condoned, or at the very least overlooked, the rape of Indigenous women, forced Indigenous people into bondage to search for gold, severely punished those who did not comply. His actions, representing a system that officially sanctioned the possession of land that was not inhabited by Christians, the forced servitude of its inhabitants, and the theft of its material resources, directly and quickly resulted in the decimation of thousands of indigenous people in the Caribbean and set the stage for continued dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Now, whether he did this to generate funds for a crusade to return Jerusalem to Christianity or out of his own lust for power, status, and wealth doesn't matter. Christopher Columbus does not represent American values, at least in my opinion. He represents expropriation, exploitation, dehumanization of others, and by any measure, theft, greed, and genocide. When you read the UN's definition of genocide, it's hard not to conclude that what happened in the Americas is not genocide. I think when Columbus Day was declared a federal holiday in 1937, we did not fully understand who Columbus was or the system of values, mainly the accumulation of wealth and land exploitation and colonization at the expense of others, that he represents. It's time to rectify that. Personally, as Jillian has already said, I'd be happy to join our Italian-American neighbors in celebrating the many achievements and contributions of Italians and Italian-Americans. I'd be glad to march in a parade honoring Galileo, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Enrico Fermi, Anthony Fauci, and hundreds of others who have contributed enormously to making this world a better place. We can do this throughout the month of October, but I do not see how we can do this on the second Monday of October while acknowledging Indigenous peoples. This idea is incredibly offensive to Native Americans for the same reason that celebrating Robert E. Lee Day on Martin Luther King Jr. Day in Alabama and Mississippi is offensive to African Americans in those states.
Jillian, would you like to add to that?
I think Greg got it. I completely agree. I think that, again, we can't take Columbus and then decide we're also going to share a day for Indigenous peoples and celebrate this individual who was responsible for enslavement and violence against Indigenous peoples. It just, personally, as Greg said, I just cannot understand the logic behind that. So we need to have, an Italian Heritage Day and an Indigenous Peoples Day.
Separate days, separate from each other.
Separate from each other, because we wouldn't be doing either cultures. We would be doing them a disservice, right? Like, it's like if you have two children, do you give them a birthday party on the same day? Like, we want to honor, these cultures. I want to be able to eat Italian food and celebrate my culture, but I also want to be able to honor Indigenous peoples and their culture and their richness and their achievements. And those things need to be done separately.
So thank you. I have one last question for you, which is, in your opinion, as the representatives for Indigenous Peoples Day Committee for the Wellesley campaign, how would voting yes to question 1 benefit the town of Wellesley? Jillian, would you like to start this one?
Sure, I would like to start. I think as we sort of started off this conversation, our town and our country right now is at a crossroads, and we are being asked to take what we know now and to be better. And we need to make conscious decisions to be the best version of ourselves and remove racist symbols like Columbus by voting yes on question 1 and establishing an Indigenous Peoples Day. You know, we, the town of Wellesley, we need to choose to be better. You know, we have the choice to make a better, kinder, more ethical town and more ethical decisions. And as I mentioned before, Wellesley is a leading town on so many different things: education and in the environment, conservation. You know, a lot of things happen in Wellesley before they happen in other places. And we want to continue that trajectory. We want to lead in creating a more inclusive environment.
Thank you. And Greg?
Well, I would just say that Jillian summed it up beautifully. You know, voting yes on question 1 gives us the opportunity as a community to say we support the nationwide reckoning with our racist past that is happening across the country right now. I think it's an opportunity to examine the privileges that most of us, but not all of us, enjoy. I think it's also an opportunity to learn more about Indigenous cultures and perspectives, and hopefully begin to educate our children with a more truthful narrative about our beginnings than is currently taught in our classrooms. I agree with Jillian that Wellesley is a wonderful community. I think we build on our progressive legacy by rethinking our celebration of Columbus Day and instead recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you so much. And would either of you like to add any other thoughts to conclude? Anything else you'd like to say and think of?
Sure. And I'm just going to tell you right now, I don't know if you're going to want to edit this, but I will.
Fine.
Something that has been sticking with me about the Unite Wellesley initiative when the Italians against Columbus Day or against IPD Day, they sort of rebranded themselves to Unite Wellesley. And, you know, I've been doing my homework and reading what they have posted, and something that stuck with me is that they say that they want to honor all cultures and that they recognize, you know, our town's Native American roots. But can you really honor a culture while still celebrating, you know, a person responsible for the violence of another culture? And so for me, Unite Wellesley doesn't really feel like Unite Wellesley, because those two things, they don't go together. So I think, you know, the Committee for Indigenous Peoples Day, voting yes on question 1, if you really are passionate about uniting this town and uniting Wellesley, then, you know, vote yes on question 1, and, you know, let's establish Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you. Greg, any other thoughts?
No, I just think that sums it up beautifully.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming over and talking about these very, very important issues with Wellesley Media.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rama,
Rama.
for the opportunity.
I think what the impetus for that was the whole conversation that's taking place around Wellesley regarding changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's a conversation that's long overdue. And I think we're at a crossroads now where we're becoming more open in terms of talking about race and racism, but many people do not realize the connection, that you really can't have those conversations without talking about where it all began. And that's basically with Columbus and the doctrine, and even before Columbus, the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was basically an ideology of our religious leaders, where they felt as if that lands that were not conquered or occupied by usually white Christian settlers, that they were open for the taking. And that's what happened here in the United States. The land was taken because the people who inhabited this land, the indigenous people, were not Christians. And so therefore the feeling of entitlement that the land was to be taken, and it was. And we all benefit from that, and we need to recognize that and then do what we can now to not only recognize it, but begin the process of racial healing so that we can all move forward.